Good evening and welcome back. Before I introduce the book that I'm going to read to you, one of my stories, one of the ghost stories, a friend of mine privately commented that I sounded like the storyteller, actor Alan Rothwell. Now, people of my age would know probably who Alan Rothwell is or was, but those of you who are young enough not to have been at school in the the early 80s, would not know who I'm talking about. Well, Alan Rothwell, he appeared in Coronation Street, and his most famous role was in Brookside, but he was also the storyteller in a children's school program called Picture Box, and it had this weird, eerie style of music, and it had this black ornament which spun very, very eerie, and then all of a sudden Alan Rothwell would inevitably be reading from a book. There is plenty of examples on YouTube. So he would say hello like that, or hello like that, and then he would use this voice, and he would talk like that. Well, I have in my collection a video of the music to Picture Box, and the book he was going to be talking about was on dinosaurs, and he would read for about, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and well, the music was perplexing. It was a really weird style of music, and I don't know, think of that music, if you know what Picture Box was from. Think of that music and that spinning ornament as I'm now going to read to you from a book called The True Ghost Stories from World War One and World War Two. Now, this story is by Harold J. Wilkins, who was a US Air Force pilot in the Second World War. And it's entitled The Strange Mystery of the Foo Fighters. Now, the Foo Fighters, as we know, are a very successful music group. But they're also a name for what I'm about to read to you. So, forgive me for saying hello, but I'm not going to read like Alan Rothwell, but I will read in my own usual way. But being compared to Alan Rothwell is quite epic. So the Strange Mystery of the Foo Fighters by Harold J. Wilkins. During the closing months of the war, our fighters chased weird coloured balls of fire that suddenly disappeared. I apologise for my neck movement. One of the most baffling mysteries of World War II were strange aerial apparitions in the shape of blazing balls, which were encountered over Truk Lagoon in the skies of Japan, the West Rhine area of Alsace-Lorraine, and over the Bavarian Palatinate. They were met by US night fighter pilots at night, obviously, by US day bomber squadrons, and, I am informed, by some British pilots. These weird balls were of fantastic and variable speeds, glowed from orange to red and white and back to orange, and appeared to have been sighted first at 10 p.m. on November 23rd, 1944, by a US pilot in the area north of Strasbourg in Alsace-Lorraine. 3 nights later, they were again seen by a US pilot flying in the same area. They were seen for a third time on the night of December 22nd, 23rd, 1944, by a US pilot flying a mission over the same area. Just before the Allies overran and captured the secret German experimental stations east of the Rhine, these balls vanished. But in no such station was the slightest clue discovered even hinting that the Nazi technicians had invented and flown these mysterious blazing balls. Over Japan, Japanese air pilots met the blazing balls and took them to be secret and mystifying aerial devices of the Americans or the Russians. On the other hand, equally mystified US pilots supposed that the balls were a curious device thought up by Japan as a last-ditch expedient to stave off mass bombing raids. One pilot chatting in the mess with others who had met the balls on night flights and had been ribbed by intelligence officers who heard their reports had a brainwave. "Let's call the so-and-sos Foo Fighters," he said. The name stuck. It seems to have been suggested by a comic strip, in which one Smokey Stover said, "Yeah, if there's foo, there's fire." Probably the slang word foo is a corruption of the French word feu, or fire. I myself, that is, Mr. Wilkins, have seen what may have been a Foo Fighter. I quote from my diary of November 2nd, 1950. At 6:20 p.m, I went out into the garden of this house at Bexley Heath in Kent, which stands on a low hill and has a commanding view of a region of Kent just 12 miles from Charing Cross in central London. I merely sought a breath of fresh air and was looking for nothing. Glancing up casually into the starry sky, I suddenly saw a yellow luminous ball appear in the southern quadrant of the sky. It flew silently, with no gas or spark emission, on a level trajectory and at no great velocity. It vanished into a belt of cumulus cloud near the zenith. It did not reappear. Was no sort of balloon, weather or cosmic. Was no meteor and no sort of pyrotechnic. Its altitude was about 2,500 feet up, and it shone with lunar brilliancy. Next morning, I read in the Daily Telegraph a report, and on the same night, but 1 hour 40 minutes later than the time of my own observation, so we're talking about 8 o'clock, people on the Hertfordshire-Buckinghamshire border, some 25 miles west, were mystified by a strange orange light flashing across the sky and visible for some seconds. Some 30 miles west of the Hertfordshire-Buckinghamshire border is the British Ministry of Supply's atomic station of Harwell in Berkshire. What I saw was, I believe, a Foo Fighter of the same type as that encountered 6 years before by US pilots. Exactly 3 weeks earlier, October the 12th, 1950, a woman cycling from Gloucester City in England reached the Barnwood suburb of the town when, as she told the local newspaper, "I was startled at 11:15 p.m. to see 4 lights, like huge stars, stationary over Barnwood. After a few moments, their lights began to wink in and out. 2 friends tell me they saw these lights that same night and that 2 of them moved over a hill about 2 miles away. I refuse to believe they were aeroplanes. Can any reader tell me what they were?" I told this woman that what she and her friends saw were probably Foo Fighters, but it must be understood that probably not one English person in a million knows what is meant by Foo Fighters or has ever heard of them. My request to the Public Relations Branch of the British Air Ministry in Whitehall, London, inquiring what reports were made to intelligence officers by British pilots who are said to have met these weird balls on war missions, remains without answer after 4 weeks. It was at 10 p.m. on November 23rd, 1944, when Lieutenant Edward Schluter, US pilot of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, stationed at Dijon in central France, took off from Dijon on a routine patrol to intercept German planes west of the Rhine between Strasbourg and Mannheim. As the crow flies, he had to fly 150 miles on a patrol that would take him east over the Vosges Mountains, a very lonely, grim and isolated range buttressing the westward approaches to the Rhine. Schlüter is a finely built man, the last word in aeronautical efficiency, and a very experienced night fighter of the Second World War. He is a native of Oshkosh, Wisconsin. With him, in the darkened cockpit of the plane, were the radar observer, Lieutenant Donald J. Myers, and an intelligence officer, Lieutenant F. Ringwald. Nothing happened till their plane had crossed the Vosges, and they had sighted the shining waters of the Rhine rolling rapidly towards Mainz. The sky that night was clear with light clouds. Visibility was good and the moon was in the first quarter. US radar stations covering all US pilots in that area had not notified the crew of any other plane in the sky. Some way to the east, Schlüter could see the white steam from the smokestack of a German freight locomotive, running in blackout conditions with firebox door clamped up and blindfolded. At this time in 1944, Germany stood at bay and the Allies were closing in on her. Some 20 miles north of Strasbourg, Lieutenant Ringwald, the US intelligence officer, glanced to the west and noticed 8 or 10 balls of red fire moving at amazing velocity. They seemed to be in formation and could be seen clearly from the darkened cockpit of the US night fighter. "Say," said Ringwald to Schlüter, "look over there at the bright lights on those hills yonder. What are they?" Schlüter: "Hell, buddy, there are no hills over there. I should say they were stars. You don't need me to tell you that it is not easy to guess at the nature of lights you see on night flights, not when they are distant as these are." Ringwald: "Stars, d'ye say? I don't reckon they're stars. Why, their speed is terrific." Schlüter: "Maybe they are just reflections from our own plane. We are going pretty fast." Ringwald: "I am certain, absolutely certain, that those lights are not reflected from us." Schlüter now gazed hard at the lights. They were now off his port wing. He got into radio-telephone contact with one of the ground radar stations. "There are about 10 Heine, that's Hunkel, night fighters round here in the sky. Looks as if they are chasing us and their speed is high. I'll say it is." The US radar station: "You guys must be nuts. Nobody is up there but your own plane. Ain't seeing things, are you?" Myers in the plane glanced at the radar scope. No enemy planes showed up on the screen. Schlüter now maneuvered the fighter for action and headed toward the lights. They were blazing red. Suddenly they seemed to vanish into thin air. 2 minutes later they reappeared, but now a long way off. It looked as if they were aware of being chased. 6 minutes later the balls did a glide, levelled out and vanished. None of the occupants of the US night fighter could make out what the red balls were. Schlüter guessed they might be some German experimental devices, like the red, green, blue and white, and yellow rockets that flashed up amid the flak of anti-aircraft batteries when a big enemy night bomber raid was on. I have myself seen such rockets when on night patrol on the edge of London at the time of the big German bomber raids in 1942 and 1943. The Germans appear to have had these mystery devices, as had the British, but I have never been able to find out what purpose they served. But the bewildered night fighter pilots did not let this mystery spoil their mission. Lieutenant Schlüter, that night, bombed hell out of 8 fast German freight trains on the Rhine railroads. Back at the base at Dijon, knowing they would not be believed by intelligence higher-ups and might be charged with hallucinations and war neurosis, Schlüter and his 2 companions said nothing. They made no report to base at Dijon. On November 27, 1944, another act in the Foo Fighter drama was staged. Lieutenant Henry Giblin, native of Santa Rosa, California, was flying a US night fighter in the Alsace-Lorraine region, south of Mannheim am Rhine. He had with him Lieutenant Walter Cleary of Worcester, Massachusetts, as radar observer. As they were approaching the German town of Speyer on the Rhine south of Mannheim, they got a shock. Some 1,500 feet above their own plane, a hell of a huge, fierce, fiery orange light shot across the night sky at an estimated speed of 250 miles per hour. Again, US ground radar stations reported when called, "No enemy machines in the vicinity, only your own plane in the sky over there." Giblin and Cleary decided to say nothing to intelligence, fearing ridicule from higher quarters. It is not wise for a wartime flyer to take such a risk. Let someone else do the reporting. No other observations of queer things in the sky came the way of the US 415th Night Fighter Squadron until 3 days before Christmas 1944. On December 22nd, 1944, Lieutenant David McFalls of Cliffside, North Carolina, and Lieutenant Edward Baker, radar observer of Hemac, California, were flying at 10,000 feet just south of Hagenau in the old German Reichsland. Hagenau is 20 miles north of Strasbourg and 16 miles west of the Rhine. Here is the report of US pilot Giblin. At 1800, 6 p.m., near Hagenau, at 10,000 feet altitude, two very bright lights climbed towards us from the ground. They levelled off and stayed on the tail of our plane. They were huge, bright orange lights. They stayed there for 2 minutes. On my tail all the time. They were under perfect control. Then they turned away from us, and the fire seemed to go out. On the night of December 24th, 1944, McFalls and Baker had another amazing experience. Here is their report. A glowing red ball shot straight up to us. It suddenly changed into an airplane which did a wing over. Then it dived and disappeared. The readers should note the sudden disappearance of this weird thing in the sky. They, if the reports are to be believed, would appear to hail from some phenomenal world of a different wavelength of visibility from our own. They, whoever these Ethereal beings are, can operate controlled machines which suddenly appear from nowhere, fly at vertiginous speeds, and as suddenly vanish into thin air. Yet in our world of radiological science, in which we have but touched the threshold of the unseen rays, in the invisible octaves of the solar spectrum, let the physicist pause before he dismisses these stories of picked men as hallucinations. It is true that in both London and New York in the late 1920s, a man on a stage was rendered invisible by warping light rays in a field of rapidly rotating magnetic poles. But the phenomena of these weird Foo Fighters are on a scale that transcends anything we have yet produced. Fates readers, see the summer issue 1948, may recall the strange experience of Kenneth Ehlers of the Land and Aids Experimental Station at Arcata, California. He directed a C-47 pilot to fly to a certain location because of the appearance on his radar scope of what are technically called discontinuities. There appeared to be 3 signals, denoting that 3 aircraft were passing over the airfield at Arcata. Yet when the pilot reached the spot in the air, he saw nothing, nor did his instruments record any electrical reactions. So far in 1944, the pilots of the 415th Squadron had seen these weird balls at night, and despite the ridicule of the higher-ups and the medical and psychiatric scepticism, other reports began to be made. In the Pacific Theatre, pilots began to be warned before starting out on missions that if they met strange phenomena in the sky, they need not conclude that they were suffering from hysteria, war-induced neurosis, or hallucinations. Pilots talking war shop in the messes called the balls krauts, or kraut balls. 2 British night fighter pilots, whose names I have been unable to ascertain, thought the Foo Fighters were secret German experimental devices, perhaps intended to strike fear in a war of nerves. Some US intelligence officers supposed they were radio-controlled objects set up to baffle radar, in the same way of the foil window that was dropped by bombers to confuse the radar watchers. Yet if they had been secret devices, no war department of any country would have risked sending them over hostile territory where they might be shot down or intercepted. There is the case of a US bomber pilot of the 8th US Air Force. He reported that he saw 15 Foo Fighters following his plane at a distance, with their lights winking on and off. A US P-47 pilot saw 15 Foo Fighters by day at or near Neustadt in the same Rhinish region area, some 40 miles west of the Rhine and 55 miles to the northwest of Strasbourg. Here is his report. We were flying west of Neustadt when a golden sphere which shone with a metallic glitter appeared slowly moving through the sky. The sun was not far above the skyline, which made it difficult to say whether or not the sun's rays were reflected from it, or whether the glow came from within the ball itself. A second P-47 Thunderbolt pilot also saw the same or another golden or phosphorescent ball, which appeared to be about 4 or 5 feet in diameter, flying 2,000 feet up. By this time, the higher-ups in the US Air Force had been forced to take notice of the increasing reports by level-headed pilot observers. It was no longer enough to wave these reports away with a smile and half-serious reference to hallucination and combat neurosis. Nor were the men satisfied at the explanation that they were flares. Whoever saw a flare that behaved as did the Foo Fighters? Flares are not manoeuvrable. The final attempt at a brush-off came from New York in January 1945, when scientists insulted the intelligence of the men of 415th. The New York scientific wallers, whatever that word means, said the men of the 415th and the 8th Air Force had been seeing St. Elmo's fire. It may be noted that St. Elmo's fire is seen on sea and land in times of electrical meteorological conditions. They have been seen at the top of Pike's Peak, from ships' mastheads, and from the tops of towers and spires. In the days of Julius Caesar, there was one occasion when these lights flashed from the tops of the spears of his legionaries. In our own time, the White Star liner Germanic in mid-Atlantic ran into a heavy thunderstorm at 1 a.m. Electrical flames 1.5 inch long jetted from the foremast truck, and small balls 1/2 inch to 2.5 inches long ran up and down the mast but were tied to it. But what possible resemblance could there have been between these weird Foo Fighters under intelligent control and St. Elmo's lights? In 1945, the Foo Fighters made their appearance in the seas of the Far East, the other side of the globe from the German Rhine, over Japan, and over Truk Lagoon. Crews of US B-29 bombers reported to intelligence that balls of fire of mysterious types came up from below their cockpits over Japan, hovered over the tails of their bombers, winked their lights from red to orange, then back from white to red. It was the same thing that had happened a few months before on the other side of the globe over the Rhine. Here, too, the weird balls were inoffensive, just nosy and curious, albeit unnerving. One night, a B-29 pilot rose into a cloud in order to shake off one of these balls of fire. When his plane emerged from the cloud bank, the ball was still following behind him. He said it looked to be about 3.5 feet wide and glowed with a strange red phosphorescence. It was spherical, with no sign of any mechanical appendage such as wings, fins or fuselage. It followed his bomber for 5 or 6 miles, and he lost sight of it as the dawn light rose over Mount Fujiyama, some 60 miles south of Tokyo. Here it seemed to vanish into thin air. The B-29s found that even at top speed they could not outdistance these balls of fire. Some 12,000 feet up over Truk Lagoon, in the Caroline Archipelago, a pilot of the B-24 Liberator was startled by the sudden appearance of 2 glowing red lights that shot up from below and for 75 minutes followed on his tail. One flaming ball turned back while the other still dogged his bomber. It manoeuvred in such a way as to suggest intelligent direction from some remote control. It came abreast of the Liberator, then it shot ahead, and for 1,500 yards held the lead. After that it fell behind. Its speed was immensely variable. As dawn came, the strange ball climbed some 16,000 feet above him into the sunshine. In the night hours, the pilot noticed changes in the colours of the ball, which were precisely what had been seen over the Rhine in 1944. It was just a sphere with no appendages. The pilot radioed to base and had the reply, "No, no enemy planes are near you. Your own bomber is the only one up there, as the radar scope shows." Now, while the Foo Fighters were making their appearance in the Far Eastern Theatre, they were at about the same time in January 1945, again sighted by pilots of the US 415th Night Fighter Squadron. These pilots reported to US intelligence at the Dijon base that over western Germany they had met the blazing balls alone in pairs and in formations. One pilot said that 3 formations of these lights, red and white in colour, followed his plane. He suddenly reduced speed and apparently took them off guard. They came on with undiminished speed and then, to avoid any collision, also reduced speed and fell back, though still dogging him. From ground radar came the usual reply: "Nothing up there but your own plane." On another occasion, when the queer formation of Foo Fighters got on the tail of a US night fighter of 415th Squadron, the perplexed and exasperated pilot swung his craft around and headed for them at top speed. As he came, the lights vanished into thin air. They simply were no longer there. Note what this pilot reported: "As I passed where they had been, I'll swear I felt the propeller backwash of invisible planes." Came the reply from a derisive ground radar station: "Are you fellas all plumb loco? You must be crazy. You're up there all alone." The puzzled pilot flew on and, glancing back, was now startled to see that the balls had reappeared about half a mile astern of his plane. He thought to himself, "I'll show these spook planes a trick." The night was starry, but near the zenith was a bank of cumulus cloud. He headed his plane at top speed right into the mass of cloud. Then he throttled back and glided down for about 1,800 feet. He turned the machine around and headed back from the cloud the way he had entered it, but on a much lower level. Sure enough, the balls had been caught napping. They emerged from the cloud ahead, but now on a course opposite to his own. It is true that when the Allies overran Germany, no more Foo Fighters were seen. On the other hand, when secret German experimental stations were seized and their secrets examined by intelligence men, nothing was found blueprinting plans for blazing balls that can be made visible or invisible in the wink of an eyelid. Such a discovery would have been the most tremendous accomplishment of mid-20th century science. It could not have been kept secret. But the Foo Fighters, like other types of flying saucers, have been seen in other days. Let us draw on the great reservoir of information of the late Charles Fort, so often tapped without acknowledgement. In his Book of the Damned, he cites Robert Mallet's catalogue, Rept. British Association, 1852. Globes of light seen in the air over Swabia, which is southwest Bavaria, or Bayern, in Germany on May 22nd, 1732. 1877, March 23rd. Dazzling balls of fire appeared from a cloud and moved slowly over Venice, Italy. Visible for more than 1 hour. Similar balls seen in sky over Venice 8 or 10 years before. October 5th. Mysterious balls like electric lights seen over West Wales coast. They appeared and vanished suddenly. High velocity. 1848, September 19th. 2 bright globular lights, blazing like stars, seen over sky of Inverness, Scotland. Sometimes stationary, sometimes moving with a high velocity. 1880, July 30th. At night, in a ravine near St. Petersburg in Russia, a large sphere and 2 smaller ones, all illuminated, seen for 3 minutes moving along a ravine. They vanished noiselessly. 1893, May 25th. Captain Charles J. Norcock of HMS Caroline saw globular lights for 2 hours in sky at 10 p.m. between Shanghai and Japan in the East China Sea. These balls of light were also seen the same night for 7.5 hours by Captain Castle of HMS Leander. He changed the ship's course to chase them, but they fled from him. 1896. A US postal clerk saw a round red light rise 100 feet over a train he was in at night at Trenton, Maryland. It rose higher and went north. At first it outsped the train, then it fell behind. 1950. October 30th, from 10 to 11 p.m. Two brilliant blue spherical lights travelled at a terrific speed over Devon, from north to south. They came inland from over the Bristol Channel. Numerous eyewitnesses included naval men at Devonport. December 2nd, in daytime, noiseless globes of fire vanished in a flash of light over Tywyn, Merioneth in Wales. At Penzance, Cornwall, players in football matches stopped play to watch a long black object with a flaming tail 4 miles long rush across the sky. At Looe, East Cornwall, a blue light, like a sausage, rushed across the sky. December 7th, balls of light seen by farmers in the then county known as Cumberland, which is now Northumberland. All descriptions tally. Cumberland could be Cumbria as well. Authority in England and the United States is all out to play down the phenomena and explain them away, even if the explanations ignore or distort the full facts. One thing it is safe to say, the derided flying saucers and other strange aerial phenomena will continue to be seen in the skies of Britain and in other parts of the world long after the one-sided talk has been forgotten. No amount of talk or conspiracy of silence can hide the truth. I'm not sure what to make of that, but as Alan Rothwell would say, goodbye, and thank you for listening and watching the video, and thank you to whoever compared me to Alan Rothwell. I'm greatly honoured by my friend who compared me. Thank you.